Okay, good afternoon. I'm Montine McNulty, CEO of the Arkansas Hospitality Association. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining to learn about the Paycheck Protection Program. It's brought to you by the Friday Firm, and I want to thank our presenters and introduce them to you. Robert T. Smith heads the Finance and Commercial Transactions Practice Group and serves on the firm's management committee. His diverse corporate practice focuses on representing companies and financial institutions in general business, transactional, securities, and regulatory matters. He has handled transactions in a variety of areas, including the banking, healthcare, real estate, and technology industries. Madeline McElhanon is an associate in the Finance and Commercial Transaction Practice Group, where she advises banking and other corporate clients on transactional, tax, securities, and regulatory matters. So we're very appreciative to them for bringing this information today, and I know you'll get a lot out of it. And thank you both for doing this.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity, and we'll tell you, we'll jump right in. As was mentioned, the focus of our webinar today is on the Paycheck Protection Program, which I'm sure everyone at least has some familiarity with. In our practices, certainly in 2020, and then for the first few months of the year here in 2021, we've spent a lot of time advising clients on mainly on eligibility and then the application process, as well as the forgiveness process on the back end. You all well know that the hospitality industry, I suppose, along with the travel industry, has taken really the most direct hit from the negative economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The numbers you see on the screen there would not be surprising to anyone, just comparing a recent week in 2021 to the same week in 2020. And as you can see at the hotel level, revenue occupancy rates are all down significantly, not a surprise there. On the restaurant side, you can see the estimate of total sales dipping $240 billion below a forecast prior to the pandemic setting in. And we were reading some reports here recently that there's an estimate of over 100,000 restaurants and bars that likely have closed permanently as a result of the pandemic. I guess the good news, if we're looking for some good news, with the second round of the PPP coming out back in January, there was a report from the SBA a few weeks ago that indicated that the hospitality industry had received approximately 18% of loans funded so far, which is about $19 billion in total funding, which is a good thing. Obviously, that 18% number is up from around 8% in 2020. Throughout 2020 for all loans funded under the Paycheck Protection Program. So there was a focus in Washington to hopefully drive more funds to the hospitality and restaurant industry, and it looks like that's working, at least under the program as it's been rebooted. We expect a lot of that is on second draw loans, which we're seeing a lot of interest for with our clients as well. And just to give you some background on the Paycheck Protection Program, just as a kind of an update on the next slide there, Tabitha. It was created under the CARES Act, which you're probably familiar with. It was passed in March of last year as the pandemic really started to set in. After that time, a lot of work by Treasury and the SBA on providing guidance and interpretations for a lot of the different issues that came up. And we've kind of joked that it was hard to advise clients or to ensure that you were advising clients of the most recent developments under the Paycheck Protection Program because there was just a flood of information coming out. There were updates during 2020, during the summer of 2020. There was the Flexibility Act, which was passed in June of last year. There was an expectation that there would be an additional kind of round or update on the program into the fall. And then as we got closer to the election, that kind of dissipated. But in total, in 2020, over $500 billion in loans were approved. We work closely with a number of lenders around the state. Primarily those lenders, as you all probably are aware, favored their current customers. So if you had a customer or banking relationship as a customer, then you were much more likely to be able to tap into that initial round back in 2020. The average loan size was around $100,000. There was a lot of criticism of larger businesses taking advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program, at least when it initially rolled out. And so we saw over the course of 2020, we saw the average loan size start out in that first month at closer to 200,000, and it whittled down to about 100,000 as there was more of a focus to get money out to smaller businesses. So there was a lot of talk on the next slide. If you look at it, a lot of talk near the end of 2020 about, once we got through the election, about some additional economic aid. And so at the end of December, as you're aware, there was a substantial bill that was passed, and it included the Economic Aid Act, which is effectively reopening the Paycheck Protection Program, allocating additional funds. A total of $284 billion is available through the end of this month. So there are a few weeks left here. Some of the provisions in the program obviously differ from what we had become accustomed to in 2020. And there have been further changes. So initially, in January, when the program rolled out, there was a focus on community financial institutions, which primarily serve low-income communities. So again, kind of a focus from Congress to try to get monies out to specific businesses and locations. About 2 weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago, and beginning on February 24th, the Biden administration announced that the program would only accept applications for a 2-week period from businesses that had 20 or fewer employees. So we're in the middle of that really right now. That will run until next Wednesday. There have also been a lot of updates that the SBA has provided even since early January, as there have been interpretations and changes and that sort of thing. The Economic Aid Act, one important thing is it clarified the tax treatment of paycheck protection loans. And you may be familiar and may recall that the forgiveness of these loans is tax-free. So it's tax-free income essentially. But the IRS had kind of waffled on how otherwise deductible expenses would be treated. And so Congress confirmed in the Economic Aid Act that those amounts would be deductible if they otherwise were deductible as a tax write-off. So that was welcome news. And I'll just point out that the state of Arkansas, I have not checked the status of this recently, but there is a bill in Arkansas House. It's Bill 1060 that would mirror that treatment for Arkansas income tax purposes. And we expect that will become law here in the state as well. The loan details, the terms of these loans have not really changed much, whether if you look back to 2020, whether you're obtaining an initial first draw loan or what they're calling second draw loans. So the loans effectively are forgivable, so they hopefully would become the equivalent of a government grant. But if the loan proceeds are used for permissible purposes, then the loan ultimately is forgiven. It's not taxable and so forth. Maddie will talk about some of the specifics of that, but generally 60% of the loan proceeds must be used for payroll purposes. And then there are, I think, 8 categories of other types of expenses that are permitted uses under the program. Interest rate is 1%. Again, that only comes into play or is important if the loan's not fully forgiven. But even if it's not fully forgiven, it is a 1% loan that has now, under the change in law, has a maturity date of 5 years. The forgiveness aspect, a lot of talk about forgiveness throughout 2020. There is a provision now that provides, or I should say initially there was a 6-month deferral on any payments that were due. The law now provides that if you apply for forgiveness within a 10-month period, then essentially you have deferral on any payments being required throughout the period that your lender and then the SBA are reviewing the loan to determine whether or not it's forgivable. And so no payments required until the end of that period. Again, no collateral, no personal guarantees. So these are intended as pure non-recourse loans. Even if they're not fully forgiven, they essentially are non-recourse loans as to the owners of the business. And then finally, there have been some issue about fees that could be charged if an accountant or a third party assists with a loan. The Economic Aid Act did make clear that a borrower can pay those fees, so that had been a question previously. The loan amount, first draw loans, and really going back to the CARES Act as it was initially put in place. Essentially, loans are the lesser of $10 million or 2.5 times monthly payroll costs. The payroll cost can be determined either on a 12-month look back to determine a monthly average, or borrowers are allowed now to use 2019 as the amount, or the time period for determining that amount. Second draw loans, which obviously if you received a Paycheck Protection Program loan in 2020 and you now come back around and make an application for a second draw loan, those loans are a little bit further limited to $2 million or 2.5 times payroll costs. However, for what we think of as hospitality industry generally, that limit is actually 3.5 times payroll costs. So there is an additional benefit for folks that are working in the hospitality industry. One of the things we always point out to clients is that there is a certification required, and you may recall that there was a lot of talk about this and a lot of movement around it last year regarding the certification that the CARES Act sets forth, that the loan is necessary based on economic uncertainty. That same certification still applies, but SBA has built that into the new rule that was issued, meaning that we're in a little bit better position for a borrower making that certification, provided they have less than $2 million in total loans, then you're able to make that, or deemed to have made it in good faith. So it takes away some of the uncertainty regarding whether these loans are really need-based, or you have to show that you needed the loan to continue in business. So it puts us in a little bit better position there. One of the things that people ask about, just to point out too, regarding paycheck protection loans is publicity, and are these, what portion of this becomes public? And essentially, these are subject to the Freedom of Information Act in terms of the information contained in an application. SBA has put that out essentially for the first 2 rounds of the Paycheck Protection Program. So those types of things are out there and are public. To the extent that's a consideration. There have been some cases or some claims made under what's called the False Claims Act, which is it's a government statute to recover funds in the event there are allegations someone obtained monies from the government illegally. And so there has been some news about those here in the last few months, just to be aware of that. From an eligibility standpoint, there were a few changes to who is eligible in terms of 2020 versus the new reboot of the program. But for the most part, it's pretty much the same. Businesses that were in operation before February 15th, 2020, so that was the cutoff initially. It's the same cutoff. One of the common questions we've had is if you had a business that changed ownership or changed hands during that period or after February 15th, essentially. So if you had a situation where a business operated through February 15th, maybe in March of 2020, and then sold assets, does that new owner that's operating the same business effectively, do they qualify under the program? SBA has clarified that typically that successor owner would be able to kind of look back to its predecessor's operations prior to February 15th, so you could apply there. Initially, these are SBA or Small Business Administration loans, so the size of the business is important. Obviously, the original CARES Act requirements were a business that employs no more than 500 employees, and that's still the case for first draw loans, but for second draw loans, it has dropped down to 300 in terms of the size. There are additional requirements on the second draw loan. I think Maddie will talk a little bit about those. They are more need-based, I would say, because they're based on reductions in revenue that a borrower experienced in 2020. And continuing on eligibility, again, not a lot of changes from what we saw in 2020 under the CARES Act in terms of the types of businesses that qualify. There were a lot of talk back then about sole proprietors, independent contractors, and so all of those types of businesses do qualify or can qualify under the program. 501c6 organizations is listed at the bottom there. Those are your chambers of commerce or trade associations. Those types of organizations do qualify. One of the, I guess, more notable exclusions that was added under the new law, under the Economic Aid Act, was to exclude public companies, so publicly traded companies. Even though they could have qualified back under the 2020 program, they did not qualify under the updated program. And I will turn it over to Maddie with that.
Thanks, Robert. So much like the first round of PPP, the SBA's affiliation rules are still in effect. So in most cases, a borrower will be considered together with its affiliates for purposes of determining eligibility. On the PPP application, the borrower will be required to list affiliates. And then the lender can make a determination as to which affiliate should be considered. And this is relevant for determining both the number of employees and the loan amount. I'll note that affiliates are not taken into consideration for the monthly payroll calculation, but there is a maximum cap of $20 million for PPP funds to an entire affiliated group. So under the SBA rules, there are 4 tests to determine affiliation. The first one being ownership. And so this is really looking at a majority ownership. Does an entity own 50% or more of another entity? If so, those entities would be considered affiliated. Minority ownership can also trigger this ownership affiliation if the minority shareholder is capable of blocking board action or similar control like that. Another test is stock options, convertible securities, and agreements to merge. And the important thing here is that any stock options or agreements are treated as though they have been exercised. As far as management triggering affiliation, we're looking for presidents, CEOs, similar management across more than one entity. This would trigger affiliation. And the last one being an identity of interest. So these are multiple businesses with similar interests, with some type of connection, like a family relation. For this audience, I think it is important to note that there are some waivers. And one of those notably is for the hospitality industry and having multiple locations. And then also for franchise businesses, franchises will not be considered affiliated with the company in which they are franchised. So as Robert alluded to earlier, PPP proceeds must be used in certain ways to be able to qualify for full forgiveness. So funds must be used during your selected covered period. So the Economic Aid Act granted some flexibility to borrowers on this area. Now borrowers can choose a sliding scale between 8 and 24 months, and this covered period begins the day that the funds are dispersed. Borrowers must maintain similar levels of both employment and salary. At least 60% of the loan proceeds must be used on payroll expenses. These are things like salary, wages, tips, and qualified insurance costs. And then up to 40% of PPP loan proceeds may be used on eligible non-payroll expenses. These have been, and under the CARES Act, these were things like mortgage interest, rent, utility payments, or interests on debt that was incurred before February 15th of 2020. But the Economic Aid Act actually added 4 new qualifying expenses. And so to break down these new qualifying expenses, the first one is operational expenditures. This is expenditures that are related to software and cloud computing services that facilitate business operations. It also includes supplier costs, which are certain goods in connection with the business, worker protection expenditures, and these are things like COVID supplies, sanitation, social distancing expenditures, etc. And lastly, the Economic Aid Act added property damage costs as a qualifying expense. And these are costs that are related to property damage from looting or vandalism from public disturbances in 2020. So the Economic Aid Act added second draw PPP loans. So for borrowers who previously received a PPP loan, they are still eligible for a second round. In order to be so, that borrower must have used up all of their first PPP loan. They must have, again, been operational before February 15th of 2020. The business must still be open and operational. It must have no more than 300 employees. And if your business has multiple locations, this 300 employee limit is per location. The borrower must also be able to show a 25% or greater revenue reduction in gross revenue. And the first draw PPP loan must not be under review. So the major changes here are the 300 employee cap versus the 500 under the previous program, and the introduction of this 25% or greater revenue reduction in gross revenue. I'll also note that for a first draw loan to be under review, SBA has come out and said that this is a formal process. This is not only a pending forgiveness application, and borrowers will be notified when their loan is under formal review. And if a borrower has not previously been notified, has not received forgiveness, and applies for a second draw PPP loan, they will be notified of that review at that time. Breaking down that revenue reduction requirement, this is a 25% or greater revenue reduction comparing 2019 to 2020. And it must be calculated using gross receipts. Gross receipts generally include all revenues in whatever form received in accordance with the borrower's accounting method. But I'll just note that it does not include previous PPP loans or EIDL advances. When comparing 2019 to 2020, borrowers can compare calendar quarters, or they can compare the entire year. There are certain businesses who were not in operation in all quarters of 2019, and we've had several clients ask questions about how to calculate this revenue reduction if they were not. The SBA has issued guidance on this, and there are several mechanisms in place if your business was not in operation all of 2019. It usually ends up with comparing multiple quarters in 2020. Your lender will require certain documentation to verify that 25% revenue reduction. And the three types of documentation are on the screen in front of you. Those are quarterly financial statements of the entity, quarterly or monthly bank statements of the entity showing deposits from the relevant quarters, or annual IRS tax filings. For loans that are under $150,000, this required documentation will not be required at the time of application to the PPP program, but will be required at the time of a forgiveness application. If your loan is over $150,000, you must present one of these three documentations at the time that you apply. For borrowers who do not have their 2020 financials complete, there is also a mechanism in place where borrowers can verify and certify that their 2020 financials they've presented to the lender are, to the best of their knowledge, accurate. Borrowers can be matched with a PPP lender through SBA's lender match program. So borrowers who did not receive a PPP loan in the first round, who are looking to get a first draw right now, and are unsure where to look, there are many lenders who we've worked with who are listed on that lender match program. The applicant must submit the application form, or some lenders are using an equivalent form. And if the loan is over $150,000, you will be required to submit the 25% revenue reduction if it is your second draw PPP loan. Also, at that time, you will be required to submit documentation to prove your payroll amount. And again, your loan amount will be determined by 2.5 times of that payroll amount or 3.5 times for the hospitality industry. And like Robert was saying earlier, there are certain certifications that must be made on that application, one of which being that the loan is necessary for the borrower. As far as forgiveness, the amount of loan forgiveness can be the full principal amount of the loan plus any accrued interests. To receive that full forgiveness amount, borrowers must have utilized their PPP loan proceeds properly. You must apply for forgiveness within 10 months of the end of the covered period that you select. And one of the big changes from the Economic Aid Act is that if a borrower previously received an EIDL loan, this amount is no longer remitted from the PPP forgiveness amount. So if a borrower received a first round PPP loan and did remit the EIDL loan, the SBA is currently addressing and reimbursing borrowers for that lack in forgiveness. Forgiveness applications were updated for the second round of PPP, and the biggest change is that for loans less than $150,000, there is now a simplified forgiveness application that is just 1 page. And you will be, if your loan is less than $150,000, again, you will be required to submit evidence of that 25% revenue reduction at the time you apply for forgiveness. So I'm looking at the chat box, and right now we don't have any questions. So if any of our viewers have anything, go ahead and put it in the chat box now, and hopefully Robert and I will be able to address your concerns. But in the meantime, we are putting out articles and staying up to date with PPP. The link on your screen will take you to our homepage where we are posting alerts, or you can sign up to have those alerts delivered directly to your inbox.
And Maddie, it looks like we did not have any questions. And folks, you can certainly, as Maddie mentioned, go on our website. Our email addresses and contact information are on there as well. So we'd be happy to discuss any questions or issues that you might have. With that, we will wrap it up, and we appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you.